'Cause I wasn't looking for this. Now I'm lying on the floor, feeling all the side effects. What up, perps? Kid Copious back in effect. Purple State Party. You know what we're doing here. Repping America, the center, and common sense. So I just wrapped up another year, going into our 7th year now. I don't know what the format's going to be for this new one in terms of titling it. It's probably going to be the same chaotic anarchy that you hear every week. And if you are listening every week, love you, appreciate you. Please help me grow this because, I'm really only trying to do what's right. I'm not trying to win it for my team because my team's purple and we don't really have too many representatives, at least not on the big stage. So let's get that changed and let's get it rolling. All right, so I'm going to start with a little trigger warning here. I'm going to be agreeing with Michelle Obama, John Fetterman, and Gavin Newsom. We're revisiting an old theme here about how people just expect that we're going to forget, and then they can just change their message whenever they want because we don't really remember what was said before. The reason I'm bringing this up is, I watch a lot of PBS. I am a supporter of PBS. I was watching some of my mystery shows on there. They got some great ones. Unforgotten is one of them. May Gray, and the latest one that I've been watching is Bookish. I put my plug in because I like them. I like what they stand for. I don't really pay much attention to their news. I don't watch any broadcast news of any sort. Fox, CNN, PBS, NPR. I just don't. Okay, I have one show and one show only, and that's the Armstrong and Getty show on 790. But anyhow, I was starting the episode of Bookish, and a guy comes on, and he's almost in tears about how, because we lost our federal funding, we might not be able to bring you this show. But, just a few years ago, they would have people come on and say, we only get a small fraction, like 2% of our funding comes from the government. A majority of our funding comes from viewers like you. Yeah, okay. And the thing is that the people who are delivering some of these messages of, thanking for support are like senior vice presidents of large donations. I think, really, that's just bloat. And the government has so much bloat, and big corporations have so much bloat. I go into offices all the time for my job, and I see this kind of stuff where it's like, really, you need like a team of people? We're going to be looking at some government bloat today, and it's like, you really need 36 people to do that? Now, I'm glad it keeps people at work, but I think in my ideal world, instead of having one PBS that has a bunch of bloated positions, wouldn't it be better if we had 3 or 4 PBSs, public broadcast channels, and they each had like a vice president or just a president of donations? I mean, a senior VP, which means there's a president, there's other VPs because you're the senior VP. It's just bloat. And that's what we see in the government. We have 8 people doing a job that one person could easily do. And that's where a lot of our money gets wasted. And that's one of the problems. That's why we're facing right now, I think here in America, we're facing this problem of states and the feds and everybody who can is trying to raise taxes and fees on things because they've blown the money. We'll get a little more into that, But, one of the things I wanted to talk about was comedian Andy Dick, love him or hate him. Andy Dick, 60 years old, was being pushed around L.A. in a wheelchair, and he just got out of a 50-day rehab stint. And he's one of those guys, Andy Dick, Bam Margera, people like that I'm fans of. I was a fan of Andy Dick's back when he did News Radio with Joe Rogan. I mean, that's an odd one right there. News Radio featuring Joe Rogan. It was a comedy. It was a sitcom about a news station in New York. But, stories like Andy Dick's sort of explain the problem we have in America with a large percentage of our homeless population and our criminal population. People have a very difficult time getting themselves back on the right path. The demons that live inside your head will easily divert you right back to that. And, I wish him the best. I wish Andy the best. I love him. I understand that he's not for everybody, but, as somebody who has survived drug and alcohol addiction and just about lost his life to it, I really sympathize with what these people are going through. But we have to remember that it's sometimes in their best interest to show tough love. And that's what we're not doing here in California. We call it compassion to let people live on the streets. There was recently a couple of actors that were found on the streets. I mean, Andy Dick himself was found passed out. They had to administer Narcan on the streets of Los Angeles. I understand that it's a difficult decision to force somebody to get help and to force them into a situation where they have to stay sober. But it's also called saving somebody's life. I pray for you, Andy. I know you're not hearing this, but I pray for all the addicts and alcoholics out there. I know what you're struggling with, and I got your back. All right. So, I prepped this show throughout the week. I gather articles, and then on Saturday, I edit out which ones are important, which ones I've debunked, because I do try my hardest to debunk stories, and I don't want to bring you things that the extremists have said. I want to make sure I'm on point. But as usual, another Saturday rolls around, and we've got breaking news. We have struck, alongside with Israel, we have struck Iran. Operation Epic Fury is the air campaign against Iran. Our aircraft carriers and Israeli Air Force are involved in striking targets in Iran. There are reports that we struck at a leadership meeting. It's possible that the rulers of Iran have been killed. We don't know. It's hard to get confirmation. At the same time, Israel launched Operation Roar of the Lion. Some people have made fun of the name. I kind of like it. But it was a cyber attack. We're taking out their infrastructure, their electronic infrastructure. This seems like it's going to be a major push. The House Democrats, of course, are upset about it. And they're going to have a virtual caucus to discuss a Zoom call. It's really that important to them. It's just mind-boggling. Europe, England, France, Germany, and the rest of them, they want a flimsy negotiated solution. Yeah, right. That's done. You can't. It's just like addicts. You can't negotiate with them. You have to have a firm hand. Macron says it's dangerous, but so is non-action. And of course, the UN wimps out. But I'll give Canada credit, because Canada, along with Saudi Arabia, recognize that the time to strike has arrived, and they are backing us. Some of them are going to join us. Saudi Arabia certainly is. They're letting us use their airspace. We'll see what Canada contributes, but they're not denouncing what we're doing. And of course, John Fetterman, the Democrat senator, he agrees. And I believe that John Fetterman is the example of what I'm trying to propose through Purple State Party. He's a centralist because he knows that's rightfully correct. Those are the answers in the middle. He also went on to yell at Democrats about their yelling and screaming during Trump's speech. Like he said, I don't care if it's a Republican or a Democrat, it's a president, don't just do that. They heckled Trump, and one of them was thrown out, and apparently one of the guests was arrested. And it is kind of sick when Trump talks about the first duty of the American government is to protect American citizens, not illegal aliens. And when Democrats didn't stand up and applaud, he said, you should be ashamed of yourself. And Fetterman went on to say, of course I shook his hand. He walked in, and I'm always going to do that for sure. There's just no dignity, like Fetterman said, in this schoolboy mentality of heckling and signs and all of that. And I don't care who it started with. I don't care who's done it in the past. That's immaterial to me. We need to get beyond that. We need to realize that you're working together for the good of the country. And the left, the one thing I have to say about the left is it's got to be exhausting to be continually shifting your point of view. You back the Palestinians, and then you back the protesters in Iran, but now because Trump is attacking Iran, you're almost going to be backing Iran now. You got to keep in mind that Obama, Bill Clinton, icons of the Democratic Party, were friends with the Bushes. They got along. They understood that it was different points of view, but the same goal. But it's not that anymore. There's people out there debating whether we should be attacking Iran or why are we spending our tax dollars protecting Israel. You're an idiot if you say that. Iran funds terror around the world. They are the leading funder of these groups that attack various countries throughout the year. Teddy Roosevelt said it best, right? Speak softly and carry a big stick. I'm fine with that. Let's talk to Iran. Time's up. Now it's time for the big stick. And if you're going to have that big stick, you have to use it. You can't signal to the world that, yes, we are the powerful military, but we're not going to do anything. Because then it's a useless stick. And, I was talking about Fetterman earlier and how I believe that he's a centralist because that's what he believes is correct. Conversely, I think Newsom, Gavin, is moving to the middle because his handlers see the writing on the wall. That no one wants what the far left is offering. Millions of dollars being spent on equity, bullet trains to nowhere, windmills, less police, more crime, less jobs, expensive housing, illegal, unvetted motherfuckers just streaming across the border. I mean, we have let in armies of cartels and armies of terrorists just come across our border. Have they acted yet? Yes, in some cases they have. In some cases they're what's known as sleeper cells, but we don't know. The far left wants to reward laziness and then just tax people more. But then you end up with bad roads, failing education systems, and then they want complete control through central planning. And central planning does not work, okay? The federal government does not know what's best. I understand that California has a lot of services that they don't have in so-called red states. But in red states, they also operate under kind of the motto of you can handle it yourself. And in some ways, that is America. We don't need the government doing everything for us. I know people, I grew up with people who lived in rural areas, who burned their trash, who really only had trash pickup once a month. They took care of it. They burned it. Not great for the environment. I understand that. You bury some of it. Okay, cool, whatever. But you take care of yourself. My grandparents' house was serviced by their own private well. They were in Washington State, where that makes a little more sense because of all the rainfall that they have. But they lived off a well, them and their neighbors. At one point got together and had a well dug and piped to their house. They don't have water service. Here in California, everything is controlled by the government. And it is a bit frightening, considering what the government does sometimes. So here's the headline. Amid angry backlash, serial child molester is rearrested the same day he was set to be paroled. This is this guy, Funston. And basically, in 1999, he was convicted of 16 counts of kidnapping and child molestation. And he was sentenced to 3 consecutive, not concurrent, consecutive sentences of 25 years to life. He is, like the judge who did the sentencing said, he's the monster parents fear the most. He used candy and even a Barbie doll to kidnap and sexually assault kids as young as 7 years old. But he is going to be paroled. He was paroled, in fact. California has a thing called the elderly parole program, generally considers the release of prisoners who are older than 50 and have been incarcerated for at least 20 continuous years, considering whether they pose an unreasonable risk to public safety. In this guy Funston's case, they said, oh, well, he did well. He had a detailed plan. He went through extensive self-help, therapy work, sex offender treatment. He called himself a selfish coward at his parole hearing. He called himself a selfish coward for victimizing young children. And that he was, quote, disgusted and ashamed of my behavior and have great remorse for the harm I caused my victims. Right. And in 2021, he admitted that he still fantasizes about having sex with children. One of his victims said, he's one sick individual. What if he gets out and tries to find his old victims and wants to kill us? Yeah. Even Gavin Newsom, who's now pretending to be a middle-of-the-road guy, disagreed with it. Right? But what happened was, up in Placer County, he was accused in a 1996 case. And the prosecutors in Placer County have decided, at the time, they decided, we're not going to prosecute him because he's already been convicted. He's already going to serve 3 life sentences, essentially. So what's the point? We don't need to spend money on this case, You have to make those decisions sometimes. And that's one of those things that I wish the government would do more of. Look at, does it make sense to spend the money on it? Just for, a symbolic victory. Which, I agree, the victims do deserve that victory, but at what cost? But fortunately, they didn't pursue the case. Well, there's no statute of limitation. So now they're reopening the case. Before he got out on parole, he was rearrested, and he's being held without bail. This is nuts. The idea that just because you reach 50 years old, you're no longer a threat to society, it's crap. I'm not taking his word for it. I don't give a shit what the guy says. Oh, I was a monster for doing this. Yeah, of course you're going to say that. You're not going to be honest. Wow, you went through some... I mean, how many of you out there have taken OSHA or sexual harassment or workplace violence or other types of classes to satisfy some state requirement, especially here in California, for your employment? How many times did you agree with those things knowing full well, I don't really agree with this? I think a lot of us are that way. But, not to be outdone, Oregon took it one step further. Oregon Senate Democrats voted to kill an effort to require federal authorities be notified when an illegal immigrant convicted of a violent felony is about to be released. So, the state government in Oregon, thinks that if you beat up and rape a woman and you serve your time, Oregon would like to have you back as a citizen. Who the fuck's voting for this? Who really agrees with this other than idealistic politicians or lying-ass politicians who are just trying to placate the young and far left? This is insane to think that a violent criminal should not be deported. That is insanity. This has nothing to do with being compassionate towards people. This is just logic, folks. But, California fires back. They're like, hey, look, we're the cuckoo far left. They let out 9 individuals from state penitentiaries. They were all criminal illegal migrants who had committed sex crimes against young girls. ICE had to come and find them. Is that really what we want? And here's the thing. That's not what we want. A majority of people do not want 9 sex offenders living in California who could be deported. They want them deported. But this small minority of loudmouth teen punks who want to flip off cops and burn down buildings and all that shit, they're like, yeah, this is what we want. And so they do it. All they had to do was pick up a phone and call the federal government. And the federal government would have taken these 9 individuals, put them in jail, and then deported them. But since the beginning of the year, California has declined 4,500 immigration detainers on criminal illegal migrants, releasing them. And this includes murderers and sex offenders back into the community instead of federal custody. And of course, the Democrats argue back. Most of the deportations under Trump are not for violent crimes. Well, what is violent? California's reclassified things. New York's reclassified things. And who gives a shit if it's violent or not? What about all the people whose lives have been upended by crime? What about all the people who are having to fight the IRS right now because somebody was using their identity and earning money on their identity? or on their Social Security card. We covered this before. Don't forget, we covered a boy who was kicked off Medicare because he earned too much. And it turned out it was an illegal using his Social Security. Yeah. But the far left is not going to go away quietly. Jennifer Welch, she's a podcaster. I thought she was kind of funny when I saw her commercials on TV, but then I found out what her politics were and how far gone she was. She accused Democrat governor of California, Gavin Newsom, of committing political suicide Wednesday after he called on the Democratic Party to become more culturally normal to win elections. Wow. Yeah. Newsom's quote, "From a tactical perspective, from the prism of purely politics, there is no doubt that the Democrat Party needs to be, dare I say, more culturally normal." See, that's him lying. That's him reading the writing on the wall and realizing that we don't want this far-left craziness anymore. So we need to, from a strategic standpoint, because then he went on to say, "I believe that less prone to spending a disproportionate amount of time on pronouns, identity politics, more focused on tabletop issues, things that really matter. The stacking of stress in terms of electrical bills, Democrats' fault. Childcare costs, healthcare, Democrats' fault. And obviously housing costs, also their fault." So he's not really saying that we should be culturally normal, or, in other words, pull the Democratic Party a little more towards the center. He's saying that for political gain, but I still agree with the sentiment, okay? Next person I'm going to agree with. Hold on. Michelle Obama complains that society tells women don't have an abortion but fails to aid mothers. And I firmly do believe that. A lot of people who say they're pro-life are just pro-birth. But she went on to say that, and I know this from my own experience having a child, that women take a long time to physically and mentally, hormonally and all that, to recover from childbirth, okay? Childbirth is not what you see on TV. Childbirth is not what people purport it to be. It is traumatic, to say the least. I'm all for birth. Don't get me wrong, okay? But it is. Your hormones, your physical body are all messed up, and we don't give them time to recover. We often force them, like in my case, I'll tell you my story really quickly. I was going through a period of time where I had to be on medication for anxiety and depression. I was useless, okay? My wife had given birth, and she had some maternity leave, but she had to go back. And she just couldn't do it. She couldn't be away from the baby. Like, she felt like her work was getting in the way of what she considered to be important, which was nursing and taking care of our new baby. And so she quit her job. And for a while, we lived off her 401k, got taxed heavily for that. And eventually, I just had to suck it up and go back to work. And it didn't, I was doing mortgages. I wasn't making a lot of money. And fortunately, along the way, God threw me a curveball that I managed to hit. And I built myself a career in the fire alarm industry. And, it was difficult. And I saw my wife struggle. I saw her struggle with depression and just being tired and just like wanting so bad to do everything for our baby, but so unable to. And we need to fix that situation. Michelle Obama's right. We need some solution to help these mothers out. And, the one thing that they need is money, okay? That's what you need to replace if you have to leave your job. And places like California and New York could help. But instead, they waste money on bullet trains to nowhere and just crazy amounts of bloat and pork and fraud. All that money that's been defrauded could have helped every single woman who gave birth in California. But instead, we have Gavin allocating $35 million in state fundings to support illegal immigrants as the Trump administration carries out massive deportation agendas. I don't understand this. We are paying so much money here in California, hundreds of millions of dollars, to help illegal immigrants. Like, why are we paying to help these people? I mean, that should be a federal responsibility because you didn't migrate to California, you migrated to the United States. And, shouldn't that be the person's responsibility? You go to the embassy, you apply, you pay the fees. They should be paying their own way. And they shouldn't need help once they get here because, ducks in a row. They shouldn't need to fight deportation because they never should have come here in a way that involves deportation. If you want to reform our immigration rules, if you want to help out lower class citizens migrate to the United States through work visas and all of that, then let's do it. Let's do that. Let's make it easier to come here legally. But why on earth are we spending that kind of money to help illegal immigrants, people who were not invited? Harsh but true, okay? I understand they come here looking for a better life. Well, let's do it in a way that they can come here and look for a better life, but being vetted, being on paper, and not requiring hundreds of millions of dollars to fight deportation. I want to know, Gavin, how much money did California give to these people when it was Obama doing it or when it was Biden doing it? None, because what you're doing is simply fighting Trump. We give Churla, an immigration advocacy group, over $100 million every year. Why? That's their responsibility. Get your own ducks in a row. Oh, man. Bloat. We were talking about it earlier, and I wish I had more time, but we got to talk about Mamdani here. He wants to pour millions into racial equity in New York City and cut over 5,000 NYPD jobs. This is insane what they're talking about. They're talking about one office getting $5.6 million, another office getting $4.6, a combined total of $10.2 million. And you're looking at this in New York City. This is just for the city. The Office of Racial Equity employs a staff of 38. The Commission on Racial Equity, that's different than the Office of Racial Equity, has 16 different jobs in it. The Department of Education pays somebody to be a chief diversity officer. The fire department has 3 diversity inclusion officers making a combined $300,000. It's the fire department of New York City spends $500,000 on civilians for diversity. And now they want to add a chief diversity officer at $100,000. This guy Mamdani, we talk about voter ID, right? And Chuck Schumer of New York comes out and calls it Jim Crow 2.0. Well, now New York's got Jim Snow 2.0. Yeah, apparently there's a blizzard that was coming in and they needed emergency snow shovelers. But you had to show up with 2 forms of ID, including a Social Security card. And you had to bring those. You had to bring those to get the to get the job. And he claims that federal law makes the ID necessary. But when it comes to federal law on illegal immigration, he doesn't follow that. But he's requiring 2 forms of ID to be a voluntary snow shoveler. It's Jim Snow 2.0. I don't think I need to say much more on that. One of the interesting things about this guy Mamdani is they brag about how he got 1 million votes. Well, he got 1 million votes out of 9 million citizens. It's the population in New York City. 49% of those votes were for people who had lived in New York for 10 years but were not born there, or less, 10 years or less, but were not born there. Most of the people who voted for Mamdani were very recent, aka college people. His lowest segment of votes came from people who were actually born in New York because they knew it wasn't going to work. The problem is when you're focusing on chief executive directors of equity, you're not focusing in on the right things. When you're slashing budgets, a good example of this is in D.C. recently. They had a giant sewage spill, 250 million gallons of sewage poured into the Potomac River. And then it turns out that the guy that was running it appointed somebody who had no experience to run the program, and they spent $500 million on equity type programs, trying to bring in more workers who looked like the people they served, aka black. What does that matter? I don't give a shit what my sanitation worker looks like. I don't care what the head of my sanitation department looks like. I don't sit there and go, oh, look, he's white. Good. Oh, he'll do a good job. I want the people who are qualified. And that's what we see in governments like Gavin or Mendami. They focus on the wrong things. They focus on trying to get votes for the next step in their political career, not people who know what they're doing, not spending the money where it needs to be spent. Instead of spending that $500 million trying to make, the DC sanitation department or sewage department look more like their constituents, they could have spent that repairing things. And it's driving people up the wall. Another great example of that is right now here in Los Angeles. The Pacific Palisades, Altadena, basically burned to the ground. People's homes gone. The insurance companies not paying enough to even rebuild. The FAIR plan that a lot of these people have to rely on because they can't get insurance from other providers, not paying enough. And what's LA doing? Sending out citations for brush clearance. Yeah, true story. They're getting citations for brush clearance even though they don't even have a home, let alone brush. It's a dirt fucking lot. I know it's all going to be rescinded, but that's the kind of thing that if you were focusing in on the day-to-day operations of a city, you would have seen and put a stop to before they went in the mail. Because no matter how much it costs, that was money wasted. And that's adding insult to injury. And that's why I think politicians like Gavin Newsom are trying to move more to the center, because nobody's buying this far left crap. The truth of the matter is that we need the government to protect us from our enemies, such as Iran. We need our local governments to keep the water, the power running, to keep the criminals off the streets, to keep the roads paved so that we're not breaking our cars in potholes. Blah, 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 blah. You know the things that are important. Education. And yes, welfare, to help the people who need the help. And paid time leave so that moms who give birth can take time off. Job retraining, job help for those same mothers. That's what we need. We don't need to make sure that our city has an equity balance. It doesn't matter. If you can't find somebody who's qualified and checks the checkbox, sorry, what are you supposed to do? Because keep in mind, nowadays, the DEI movement, the far left movement, is really only about certain groups of people, not just all minorities, not all non-whites, just certain groups. Because if you're gay and white, you still qualify for one of those check boxes. And that's no way to run a government. That's no way to run a government at all. And people are seeing it. And that's why Gavin Newsom is pedaling as fast as he can back to the middle. He is a corrupt individual. He only wants the power, prestige, and money of the job. That's all he wants. And that's all a lot of these people want. Crockett, Omar, AOC, even J.D. Vance. They just want the power. See, Trump already had the power. Trump already had the money. Trump already had the prestige. So I believe him, and I believe in him, and I support what he's doing. It's not perfect, but at least it's focusing in on actual problems with actual solutions, not things that simply feel good and make the college kids like you. Because I'm pretty sure most of the college kids, at least a majority of them in our Ivy League, they don't like me. I only agree with some of what they say. I agree that certain people deserve rights, but not advantages. Enough of that. We're not going to get into that. Thank you for your time. Like I said, I love and appreciate y'all. I'm Kid Copious. I'm Purple State Party. So are you. Keep on grinding. Love one another. And DJ, let that beat drop.